I'm a big fan of the classics of Greece and Rome, and I especially have a sweet tooth for the plays, but also for those gigantic epic poems that were written back then. You know, Ovid's Metamorphoses and Homer's Iliad are two of my favorite books of all time, hands down. And Steve Donahue has been doing his daily Penguin series, where he talks about one Penguin classic every day. And he's been sticking almost entirely to the classics of Greece and Rome, mostly Rome. And he has talked about Virgil, and he has talked before about Ovid. And so I have been feeling inspired to pick up a classic of Greece and Rome. And there was one that I started last year, got about a quarter of the way through, and didn't quite finish because I couldn't quite get into it, but was inspired to finish it because of Steve Donahue's Penguin series, and it is this, Civil War by Lucan, whose full name was Marcus Annaeus Lucanus. And Lucan was born in 39 AD. He was a very high-ranking official. He was born into great privilege. Seneca was his uncle, I believe, and Lucan for a time was actually buddies with Nero, Emperor Nero, that Nero, the crazy Nero, but fell out of favor at one point with Nero, and then was caught as a member of a conspiracy to overthrow Nero, and then was forced to commit suicide when he was only 25 years old. And to think that he wrote this epic poem that we still read today, and which Dante Alighieri himself revered as one of the masterpieces of the ancient world, and he did that before the age of 25, is just remarkable, and is particularly scary for me because I am on the cusp of my 26th birthday, so it's kind of making me wonder what I'm doing with my life. But anyway, this is an epic poem that tells the story of the civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompeius Magnus, a story which is told in Appian, in his history book on the Civil War, which Steve also talked about, and is told by Julius Caesar himself in his sort of memoir, sort of narrative history of the Civil War that he wrote himself, which I have yet to read, but do also want to read quite soon. And Lucan did not manage to finish this book. It's only 10 books long, and the last book is weirdly short, and so a lot of scholars have speculated that it was supposed to be 12 books long to be modeled off of Virgil's Aeneid. Writing epic poems on historical subjects, like on the Civil War, was not uncommon in the ancient world. There was a few other epic poems that had been written about the Punic Wars with Carthage. In particular, Silius Italicus wrote an epic poem called the Punica, which is actually the longest epic poem to come out of ancient Rome, and which actually does survive, but isn't very highly regarded, and so isn't really available in an accessible translation. Even Virgil's Aeneid was telling the story of a semi-historical figure, and even Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were also telling semi-historical stories in a sort of elevated context. But Lucan's poem is so much different from any of those. To me, it's one of the strangest pieces of literature to come out of the ancient world, because it's an epic poem, and it begins like an epic poem. It begins actually, the opening lines are very reminiscent of Virgil's Aeneid. But in this epic poem, the heroes are not all that heroic. Caesar is a megalomaniac and a would-be tyrant. Pompey is well-intentioned and kind of sympathetic, but is ultimately kind of weak and incompetent, and also kind of a prick to his wife, which is something that perhaps the ancient Romans would not have held against him, but which I certainly do. And then Cato, who is a third sort of main character in this book, is the one admirable leader, but we know through historical documents of what happened after the events that are told in this book that he committed suicide. So of all the three major characters, two of them aren't that great, and the one that's good kills himself. And also, Cato is not a particularly interesting character. He is kind of unrealistically virtuous, and that makes him kind of not relatable. In this poem, too, the gods, who are such an active part of, especially like Ovid's Metamorphoses and Homer and Virgil, are never heard from. No god ever speaks to a human being in this book, and it's even suggested at several points that the gods are either powerless over human affairs or don't really care about human affairs. It was clear to the unfortunate that the gods above know too little. There arises many a substance which puts constraint upon the gods. And it is emphasized at different points in this epic that a sort of vague force called fortune or fate does kind of govern the universe, but that is so sort of broad and vague that I felt at the end like that was basically just a way of saying that there is really no actual order to the universe. The battles that happened in this book, especially the Battle of Pharsalia, which is the source of the alternate title of this book, the Pharsalia, are told in just as much brutal detail as Homer's Iliad, where it's also told in like very detailed, very gruesome manner, but that violence, for one thing, none of the soldiers are named, so there's no possibility of them sort of being elevated as heroes in terms of the violence being committed, but also that violence doesn't really serve any higher sort of purpose. None of the soldiers are named, and so we just have sort of these faceless masses of soldiers, and this description of how horribly they're all dying and how pointlessly they're all dying. And nature in this poem, too, isn't controlled by the gods like it is in a lot of other poems where you have, Poseidon who will send a tempest against Odysseus because he's unhappy with him, or something like that. Nature is just a powerful and usually very hostile force in this poem that harasses the human characters, and which the human characters often struggle to overcome. There are no less than 4 really striking storm scenes in this book, where just a storm either at sea or on land happens, where the humans are just left mostly entirely powerless, and which almost kills Julius Caesar at one point. At least in previous epics, even though humans didn't always do well in terms of how the gods would manipulate them, at least they were of interest to the gods, even if it was only to serve the gods' selfish ends, and even if the gods could be fickle. In this universe, there's just randomness, it seems. And Lucan even sort of explicitly inverts or subverts iconic events from earlier epics, especially the event in Virgil's Aeneid, where Aeneas descends to the underworld to speak to the ghosts of the dead. That event is reflected in this book in a scene where Pompey's son, who is very spoiled and kind of licentious in a sense, goes to visit a witch named Erichtho to get his fortune. And what this witch does is she takes a corpse and brings it back to life and forces it to tell Sextus being the name of Pompey's son, tell the future. And so you have this inversion where before it was Aeneas, who is this elevated hero, who is kind of a prick, but is, in the context of the poem, supposed to be this elevated hero, going to the underworld to speak to the dead. And here, on the other hand, you have Sextus, Pompey's son, who is this not particularly heroic or elevated, going to this witch to have the witch bring a corpse back from Hades to speak his fortune. So this world that we're presented with in this book is so bleak. It's devoid of gods and order. War and tyranny don't really serve any kind of a purpose. And the heroes who are spoken of are not particularly heroic, and the sort of normal everyday soldiers who you might think might be elevated to the status of heroes as a sort of everyman are never named, and just sort of are there to die in droves. And all of this kind of contributes to this poem feeling incredibly modern in a way that no other epic poem that I've read has. Now, I would be lying if I said that this was the most enjoyable epic to come out of the ancient world. Again, it took me until about a quarter to a third of the way through to really get into it and to get interested. And interesting as it is, I think, dramatically inert. The characters are convincing and well drawn, but they're not very compelling, and they're not very human. The events are told in this very sort of stilted fashion where real dialogue never really occurs, where most of the human speech are like really long sort of monologues, and all of the actions described are done in a very sort of distant way, where, you'll have a boat getting from one side of the Mediterranean to another in, the space of one stanza. It's mostly about, Lucan is mostly interested in set pieces and speeches. And so all of that can sort of contribute to this poem feeling very stiff and sometimes being a bit of a slow read. But I didn't care about any of this because of just how fascinating I found this as a product of the ancient world, where I think of it I think of the ancient world as being so hung up on the need for there being an order, with the gods and such. And this book, and how much it portrays a sort of shattered old view of the world. We had this mythological order to the universe that has now been shattered. Put me in the mind of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, where T.S. Eliot is dealing with this sort of shattered ideal of European progressivism and positivism that was just blown apart by World War I. And for all that vision's cynicism, both in T.S. Eliot, but more importantly in Lucan, for all its cynicism, that vision is conveyed in some absolutely gorgeous verse. If this translation by Susan Brown does the original Latin any sort of justice. So for those reasons, I think I will certainly reread this in a new translation and try to read about it as much as I can. I do recommend this edition. This translation by Susan Brown, again, is beautiful. Her introduction is wonderfully explanatory. Her notes are really helpful. They have little plot summaries and little just notes about certain cultural references that you might not get, and historical references and mythological references that you might not get. This book won't be for everyone. It's not a place to start with the classics of Greece and Rome, but if you have perhaps read Ovid and Virgil and a lot of other of the more well-known corridors of classical literature, then perhaps you'll be interested in this. So anyway, I would love to hear from anyone who has read Lucan. I know some of you are out there, and I would love to hear from you, any of your thoughts on this book. I will sign off for now. I think I have some groceries arriving soon. So anyway, I'll talk to you later, guys. Bye.